it's 2019, but it feels like 1933. When you know rallies are not helping and silence is complicity. When you know where the kids are kept, locked inside their cells. When you see approaching the future this foretells. When they're coming for your neighbors. When they've even said what day they plan to put them all in buses and take them away. When you know where they keep the buses. You've been to the parking lot. Perhaps a whole lot of petrol bombs is the best move that you got. Then you may ask the question, what can one person do when the time to act is now? And now it's up to you. When it's 2019, but it feels like 19.
Welcome back to part 2 of the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arneson and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. Of course, you know we continue to record on an overcast, wet, rainy Wednesday morning. So it's back to race class. We're episode 10. And again, I want to remind everyone that we've been so concerned about legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities that in an effort to sort of confront these and challenge them, The Attitude and our wonderful professor, Jonathan Feingold from BU University, BU Law School, has been joining us every single month since January, teaching us about race, teaching us about racism, teaching us about critical race theory. And during the course of the summer, we spent an incredible amount of time learning about affirmative action. But as Jonathan, as you know, while we do know that race matters and that our project is to make sense of what that means, affirmative action cases, 2 of them, are going to be heard by the United States Supreme Court on Halloween. How totally appropriate. You've spent a tremendous amount of time holding our hands, talking about all the different aspects of how we should be looking at affirmative action. And of course, the 2 cases are the University of North Carolina as well as Harvard. And you wrote, I have to tell you, it was such a clear, concise, precise piece at the Boston Globe. And it was the party attacking affirmative action just made the case for it. So, Jonathan, what you need to know is that as I'm reading this phenomenal article, and you've already taught us many of the things that are already in there, so nothing in the article surprised me, but your brevity, your precision, it was almost like the cliff notes of affirmative action, everything you need to know. And by the time you're done, you're so upset and you completely agree with the premise of your editorial, which is that the party attacking affirmative action just made the case for it. So I want to welcome you back to the program and thank you again and again and again for holding my hand and the hand of my audience as we begin to understand through race class, really the sort of the nature of racism, and sometimes in so many ways, how we've been so blind to it, even though it's been so in front of us. And you've helped to sort of take those covers off our eyes so we can see something and understand that we need to address it. And affirmative action is just one small step in addressing it, but it actually is incredibly essential. So let me welcome you back to the program and thank you again for not only doing the class, but for this fabulous piece in the Boston Globe, which, by the way, has been shared all over. When I go to Google, it's one of the first things that they actually point to about the affirmative action cases is your powerful piece in the Boston Globe.
Thank you, Arnie. As always, it's so nice to be here with you. And I have to give a lot of credit and thanks to my co-author on that piece, Vinay Harpalani, who is a law professor over at the University of New Mexico, and who co-authored with me an amicus brief that we filed in the litigation. And this piece was an attempt on our part to distill some of the main arguments we were trying to uplift in that brief, and also have to thank the folks at the Emancipator, which was the project affiliation between Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research and the Boston Globe, which was where the piece found a home. And there was one, at least to get the conversation going, I'll dive a little bit into one of the insights that we tried to foreground in the piece that you named, which is that if you take seriously the evidence that is proffered by the party attacking affirmative action, it actually makes the case for more affirmative action and not less. And it sounds, counterintuitive. How could that be? But it's actually a pretty clear line. And so let me walk through that a little bit. And then after that, maybe we can zoom out and have a somewhat broader conversation, just that everyone is feeling as situated as possible as we enter the weekend before Monday, when we're going to have about 2.5 hours of oral argument in DC at the Supreme Court regarding the future of race conscious admissions.
Let me just stop you for one quick second, Jonathan, just to let my audience know that if you go to my Twitter feed, if you go to Facebook, I actually begin a description. I pull some nuggets out of your article in my Twitter feed as well as on Facebook. But you know how I begin it? Do the math. Because in so many positive ways, not only are you sort of talking about things that might sometimes people are saying, oh, it's an impression, it's amorphous. You, in this article, you, in your amicus brief, you are basically not only telling this story, but you have the math to support it. And that, I think, is so important because you can't deny it. You can't run away from it. And the math speaks volumes about what is happening and the desperate, desperate need to continue affirmative action if we are going to actually reach that quote unquote color blindness that they talk about so often, which clearly is not the case. Anyway, keep going. I apologize.
Well, let's do math in a moment. But first, actually, I think it would be helpful for me to take a half step back and explain why it is we decided to do some affirmative action math or some admissions math. And part of the reason is because the party that is suing Harvard and that is suing UNC is funded by a network of sort of your standard right-wing foundations, think tanks, legal entities. And so there's a whole network of right-wing entities that have been buttressing the legal attacks against affirmative action for decades. In 2016, that network, notwithstanding, a decent amount of success, encountered a problem. The Supreme Court, again, for the second time in just a couple decades, upheld the constitutionality of race-conscious admissions. And then so strategically, the coalition of folks trying to outlaw affirmative action, had to ask this question, well, is there anything we can do different as a matter of strategy to eliminate affirmative action? And if you were to ask Ed Blum, who's one of the primary individuals, who's sort of the face of the efforts to roll back civil rights broadly and affirmative action in particular, if you were to ask him, what's your strategy? He would tell you, quote unquote, that he needed Asian plaintiffs. He needed to change the face.
Race. He needed something that was race. Just keep going. All right, keep going.
And the backdrop that's important to know is that the plaintiffs historically in lawsuits that were challenging race-conscious admissions or affirmative action policies were white applicants who had been denied, including in the University of Texas litigation, Abigail Fisher, who by all accounts was a relatively mediocre student. The upshot is, after decades of litigation, this right-wing network had successfully chipped away at affirmative action, but the Supreme Court had continued to uphold the constitutionality of race-conscious admissions in higher education to promote student body diversity. And so Ed Blum's gambit, this right-wing network's gambit was, well, what if we shift our narrative? What if we tell the public that affirmative action is a problem morally and legally because it actually harms Asian Americans? And so there's a lot of sort of intuitive appeal to that strategy. If you can present Asian Americans as the face of sort of the fight against affirmative action, then first it can veil what is at its core an anti-civil rights project as an effort to promote the rights of a group that has suffered a history of discrimination in this country. And so part of it is just to try to rebrand the anti-affirmative action campaign as a campaign for civil rights, when it's always been a campaign that's hostile to civil rights. There's a lot of understandable appeal there. And just if you sort of watch how the media has covered these cases, it's been harder for the media to just tell a clear story about, well, who's on which side, like who's actually for civil rights. And so for Vinay and myself, what we wanted to do is we wanted to say, okay, if you were actually representing the interests of Asian Americans, and it's not to say that Asian Americans are in any way monolithic, and there's certainly tremendous divergence among the Asian American community in the United States, though it is important to know that the majority of Asian Americans do support race-conscious admissions, do support affirmative action, in part because affirmative action remains a critical tool to counter anti-Asian racism. But so then the question we ask is, like, imagine this is, you are actually a premier civil rights, like an actual legitimate civil rights organization fighting for the interests of Asian Americans. How might you litigate this case? Well, what you would first try to do is you would try to ascertain the sources of what we can just refer to as anti-Asian bias.
Right.
And it turns out that the plaintiffs did that. So the plaintiffs, again, so Ed Bloom, this anti-affirmative action network, they identified at least two sort of primary sources of what we can think of as anti-Asian bias in Harvard's admissions system, in its admissions process. Now, the kicker is both of those sources of bias are not affirmative action. They're actually facially race blind, or what we might refer to as colorblind components of Harvard's admissions process. One of those is the personal rating, which is essentially a composite score that integrates a lot of different metrics, including subjective assessments like interviews that are susceptible to implicit biases, then other sort of structural forces that can undermine certain students' ability to receive essentially the same score for the same performance. It's the same implicit bias story that we see anywhere else. And in addition to the personal rating, the other, like another substantial source of what we could think of as anti-Asian bias are Harvard's legacy type preferences, which includes pretty massive admission bonuses to the children of alumni, to athletes, and to students on the dean's list, which essentially means your parents are not just wealthy, but wealthy enough to buy a library or to at least renovate a library. And so again, according to the plaintiff's own evidence, two primary sources of anti-Asian bias are not affirmative action. They're actually facially race-blind components of Harvard's admissions process. And then you might ask, okay, well, who's the beneficiary of this anti-Asian bias? Again, just looking at the plaintiff's own evidence, it's pretty clear, and I think probably should be intuitive, that the primary beneficiaries are wealthy white applicants, not other students of color. And so now if that's the evidence presented to you and your goal is to force Harvard to administer an admissions process that is less likely to lock out deserving students of color who should be there based on their individual talent and potential, including Asian Americans, but aren't there as a function of admissions considerations that, in effect, if not on their face, reward inherited racial advantage. If that's your goal, then you're going to target the personal rating, or at least sites of Harvard's admission system that are vulnerable to implicit biases. And you're also going to target legacy admissions because it's just like such an obviously anti-meritocratic, anachronistic, in university admissions grandfather clause of sorts.
There was something that I was sort of curious about because you talk about these sort of personal ratings, which assess qualities like leadership, humor, and grit. As I was reading those three words, I was thinking about maybe stereotypes. Who's usually the head of student council? It's usually the white guy, whatever. When you think about, again, it's almost like there's this stereotype about Asians, and they're actually embracing that stereotype. And what they're doing is that therefore, if you look at leadership, humor, and grit, then the good old boy white guys come to the head of the class in that personal assessment because they usually are the only ones on the bench anyway. They have the wealth and the confidence to have the humor, and daddy pays for the grit. As I'm looking at these three words, so they sound generic on their face, but then you play it out, and guess who it embraces and who does it ignore?
And yeah, and so then let's go back to so this admission story, and then again reminding ourselves of where we started. Well, the plaintiffs are claiming that they are representing the interests of Asian Americans writ large. They are claiming that we should be suspect of affirmative action because affirmative action, harms Asian Americans. That's the claim. But the evidence, the actual evidence the plaintiffs present suggests that, yes, it seems that Asian Americans might encounter some sort of racial bias in Harvard's admissions process, but the evidence reveals that the source is not affirmative action.
Right.
It's these other sites of the admissions process that functionally reward inherited racial advantage. And so were you a defender of civil rights, that's what you would go after, but that's not what happens here. Instead, the plaintiffs conflate all the evidence to prop up a narrative that is designed to scapegoat affirmative action and to sell this story that affirmative action pits Asian Americans against other students of color, none of which is grounded in the plaintiff's own evidence. And so we go through this to just try to show, like, as clearly as we can, that Ed Bloom, he needed a narrative of anti-Asian or Asian American vulnerability to veil what is at its core an anti-civil rights agenda. And unfortunately, neither Harvard nor UNC did sufficient work from our perspective to tease out the actual facts of this case. One reason they didn't, Harvard and UNC, is because to do so, at least from our perspective, would have required them to foreground all of the ways in which ostensibly colorblind considerations function as a racial advantage for students with the most inherited racial privilege, which just brings us back to sort of the basic math, which is the basic math. We know that race matters in the United States. We know that racism is structural. And so what that means is that colorblindness doesn't get you, some promised land of racial neutrality. It is just a mechanism to, whether intentionally or not, internalize and reproduce racial advantage. And so if you aren't accounting for the ways in which race is going to differently situate students at the moment of admissions, then you shouldn't expect to get a process that is going to be rewarding the most talented and those with the most potential.
So let me I want to make sure that I get this paragraph out, because it blew my mind, because it so screamed what you are saying, and you know which one I'm talking about. You write, Harvard willfully obscures significant racial advantages white applicants receive in its current admissions process. This includes Harvard's Legacy Plus preferences, which constitute massive racial and class advantages for wealthy white students. And using the term massive, everyone, is accurate. Let me continue. The plaintiff's own expert concluded that over a recent 6-year period, 43% of Harvard's white student admits were Legacy Plus. Of that total, only 25% would have been admitted without their Legacy Plus boost. Now, hold on to this sentence and put it on your refrigerator door. This means Harvard admitted more than 1,600 white students in spite of their inferior academic qualifications. This number exceeds all Black and Latino admits from the same period. Oh my God, I want you on MSNBC. I want you on CNN. I want that paragraph heard over and over and over again, because as you point out, the plaintiffs proved your point.
And I think it's important to reiterate that all of the facts that we draw on are from either the plaintiffs themselves or from their expert. These are the parties that are suing Harvard and UNC. These are the parties that are trying to prohibit universities from even knowing or being aware of the race of their applicants. And that's in their underlying complaint. what the plaintiffs are asking for is not just to take off the table a modest tool that universities can employ to remedy their own legacies of racial exclusion or desegregate their campuses or counter white racial advantage. The plaintiffs are also telling the court that pursuant to the 14th Amendment, pursuant to Title VI, pursuant to Brown v. Board of Education, no school should even be permitted to know the race of their applicants. And, on the one hand, that's, for anyone who's ever worked in higher ed administration knows how, just from a practicability standpoint, unmanageable that would be. But think about what that would actually translate to. That would be a world in which students are censored, in which for a student for whom race is a salient aspect of their identity, or whose formative years occurred with direct awareness of the racism around them. The plaintiffs are saying that the 14th Amendment in Title VI prohibits those students from telling their story in their personal essay.
Wow.
Because they're saying, no, maybe you can write it, but then you have to redact it. And that is trading on such a radical notion of colorblindness. And also, if it sounds familiar, it should, because it's some of the same logic that is coming from the same sources that have been censoring what students and teachers are permitted to say about race and racism in the classroom.
Right.
Because the goal is not just to take off the table a material tool or policy that is both modest but essential if we want to reckon with racism. It's also trying to take off the table the very language that we need to diagnose the problem and then to prescribe a solution. I think it is important just to mark the stakes. And if it's not sort of clear who's on which side of this case, we should just look who is on the side of affirmative action and who is on the side of, anti-affirmative action. On the side of affirmative action are some of the most storied civil rights entities, including those that were on the front lines trying to topple American apartheid or Jim Crow, which includes the NAACP. Also organizations like the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the ACLU. On the other side, we have, the descendants in a particular sense of the same right-wing network that was hostile to desegregation following the Civil Rights Act, that actually opposed the Civil Rights Act, and that are currently the entities that are funding, providing the infrastructure for, and spearheading efforts to roll back voting rights, to censor speech in the classroom, to undermine reproductive freedom, and to target trans youth. That's who's on the other side. In folks like the Pacific Legal Foundation, a lot of entities that can trace money to Koch Industries, Heritage Foundation is all over this. Claremont submitted an amicus brief, governors of Oklahoma and Texas. And so we should just make clear that one of the reasons why affirmative action is also a target, like all of the other things I named, is because it is another pillar of multiracial democracy.
I want to just again read before we let you go from your powerful, powerful piece. I Facebooked it, I tweeted it out. It's so clear, it is so concise, it is so obvious on its face. Even the plaintiff's expert concedes legacy plus students are doubly advantaged. First, they are awarded for status as children of alumni, for example, unrelated to any standard conception of academic merit. Second, well before admission, this inherited status confers its own advantages, including unique access to the resources necessary to compile a competitive applicant profile. But characterizing legacy plus preferences as a double bonus understates the race and class advantages it awards. Harvard admits legacy plus applicants who do less with more, a practice that harms more perseverant and talented applicants of color and poor white students who do far more with less. These compounded advantages create a triple bonus for the wealthy, the white, and the connected. And in so many ways, this timing of this case before the Supreme Court feels so frightening, given the timing of this election, given the rise of white Christian nationalism, given the assault on voting, given the idea that, someone said that on election day, we are the government. That explains why they don't want blacks to vote, why they don't want, certain groups to vote, why they're going to make every impediment to voting because they want a government that only looks like them. They don't want that multicultural government. They don't want an educational system that embraces all, that recognizes that if you're going to actually deal with color blindness, then you actually have to acknowledge the color. And as you were describing that, you couldn't in an application talk about the fact that you are black as part of your applicant experience and what you write. I kept thinking, how could I write about the fact that I'm half Norwegian and half Italian and grew up in New York and the foods I ate and the community I was raised from and the church I went to and all those experiences that would lead me to write my college application, and you're telling one class of people they can't write about that. That is a form of censorship. That is so outrageous and wrong, Jonathan. I never even thought of it that way, but it absolutely is.
And the basic insight is that color blindness has never been some neutral or objective way to think about or talk about race and racism. It is a racial ideology. It's one that says race is not relevant until we make it so. And it's one that has served to legitimize racial inequality and to stigmatize anti-racism. That is the point.
I need to let you go. Episode 10, Race Class. What a powerful, powerful year. We only have 2 more classes left. The party attacking affirmative action just made the case for it. Evidence that a university favors white students over more qualified students of color calls for more affirmative action, not less. Jonathan Feingold teaches at Boston University Law School. He has been joining us every month since January of this year. I am so grateful. This was a powerful piece and a powerful conversation. Can't wait to talk to you next month.
Thanks, Arnie.
This is the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.